What if the fastest way to cripple a country isn't to blow up its weapons? It's to blow up the road that carries them. That's exactly what happened in southern Iran overnight, and by the time the sun came up, one of the country's most important ports was completely cut off from the rest of the nation. Before we go further, do me a favor. Tap that like button right now, not for me, but so this video reaches more people who actually need to understand what's happening in the Middle East instead of getting fed 15-second clips with no context. Hit subscribe if you want to stay. Get ahead of this story as it develops, and drop a comment telling me one word for how you feel watching this unfold. Now, let's actually break this down properly. For almost a week straight, American forces had been hammering targets across Iran from the air, missile depots, drone assembly facilities, command centers, radar installations, the kind of targets you'd expect in almost any modern military campaign, the sort of list that fills headlines but doesn't always change the shape of a war. Then, on a Thursday night in July, something shifted. The bombs stopped landing only on weapon systems. They started landing on the roads and rail lines that connect Iran's most important military port to the rest of the country. Multiple bridges near Bandar Abbas were struck in a coordinated wave. A railway junction just outside the city was also hit and destroyed. This wasn't a scattered, opportunistic set of strikes. This was a shift in strategy. And once you understand what Bandar Abbas actually is, the entire war starts to look different. Bandar Abbas isn't just another dot on a map of southern Iran. It sits right at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow stretch of water that carries roughly 1/5 of the entire world's daily oil supply. It's home to the headquarters of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy. It's where weapons shipments arrive by sea, where fuel gets unloaded, where military supplies staged for units across the south begin their journey inland. If you wanted to picture the beating heart of Iran's naval and logistical power, this would be it. So when the United States chose to stop hitting weapons stockpiles and instead started hitting the physical roads and railways feeding that port, they weren't attacking what Iran already has stored away. They were attacking Iran's ability to move any of it, anywhere, until those roads are rebuilt. Picture it like this. Imagine a warehouse stacked to the ceiling with everything a military could need. Fuel drums, ammunition crates, spare parts. Now imagine every road leading out of that warehouse has been reduced to broken concrete and twisted rebar. The warehouse itself hasn't been touched. Nothing inside it was damaged. But none of it matters anymore because there's no way to get it out. That's essentially what happened to Bandar Abbas almost overnight. Reports from inside Iran confirmed several major bridges were destroyed. One of them, the Khahuristan Bridge, sits along a critical road linking Bandar Abbas with inland Hormozgan and Fars provinces, a route that carries both civilian and commercial traffic every day. Another, the Geria Bridge, runs along the Bandar Abbas to Khmer to Lar Highway, a key crossing point in Khmer County, connecting the coast to the country's southern interior. These aren't obscure back roads used by a handful of villagers. These are the arteries of an entire region. Sever them, and traffic that once flowed smoothly from the coast into the heart of the country either finds a much longer detour or simply grinds to a halt. And this campaign didn't stop at Bandar Abbas. Strikes also hit a rail bridge far to the north in Golestan province, on a line connecting Iran to China and Russia through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. Think about what that tells you. This wasn't only about isolating one port city in the south. It was about cutting off multiple transport corridors at once, choking the route toward the Gulf on one side, and disrupting a route toward Iran's allies further east on the other. Within hours, the effects were visible on the ground. Local authorities in Hormozgan province confirmed major roads into and out of Bandar Abbas were completely blocked. Some limited traffic eventually resumed through makeshift alternate routes, but officials urged residents in commercial vehicles to avoid all non-essential travel. Sit with what that means for ordinary people living there. Trucks trying to deliver food are stuck. Workers face hours-long reroutes. Ambulances trying to reach hospitals now face longer, harder paths, if a usable path even exists. Then came an admission that caught a lot of people off guard. Iran's own energy ministry asked residents in the southern provinces to cut back on electricity use. Officially, the stated reason was summer heat driving up demand. But buried inside that same announcement was something Iran hadn't said quite so directly before. The ministry acknowledged that parts of the country's power infrastructure had actually been damaged during the strikes. That's not a minor footnote. That's a government quietly admitting, through its own state-run media, that this campaign was already reaching past military targets and into the systems that keep daily life running. Not missile depots, not radar stations, the power grid that keeps lights on in homes, keeps hospitals running, and keeps businesses open. Now here's where the picture widens even further, because this bridge campaign didn't happen in a vacuum. It came directly on the heels of another major move made just one night earlier. The United States had reimposed a full naval blockade around Iran's coastal waters and oil terminals, warning commercial shipping to stay away from any Iranian export facility. Most of the maritime industry listened immediately, but not every vessel did. One ship kept moving directly toward Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, ignoring repeated warnings broadcast over open channels. American aircraft responded by striking the vessel's smokestack and upper structure, disabling it without breaching the hull or spilling a drop of oil. No one aboard was seriously hurt. But the message traveled instantly across every shipping route in the region. Try to break this blockade, and you will be stopped without hesitation. So within roughly 24 hours, 2 separate operations sent the exact same signal from 2 different directions. At sea, any ship attempting to move oil through the blockade would be intercepted and disabled. On land, the roads and railways feeding Iran's most important naval base would be systematically dismantled. 2 different battlefields, one goal: strip Iran of its ability to move whatever it needs to keep this conflict going. Iran did not stay quiet after any of this. Within hours of the strikes, Iranian forces launched retaliatory attacks towards several countries hosting American military personnel, including Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Iran also reportedly carried out its first direct strike on a base inside Syria, a notable expansion, given how carefully Iran had previously avoided widening the conflict into new countries. But one particular strike changed the tone of the entire war more than any other that week. In Kuwait, missiles struck a facility tied to power generation and water infrastructure. Not a military base, not a command post. Infrastructure that ordinary civilians in a desert nation depend on every single day just to have clean water and electricity. This detail deserves to stop you in your tracks, because it marks the moment this conflict stopped being purely about missiles versus missiles, radar versus radar. When civilian infrastructure gets hit, even once, it changes the psychology of everyone involved. It raises the stakes for every government watching from the sidelines and makes any future de-escalation dramatically harder, because now there's real damage touching families who had nothing to do with the decisions driving this war. Iranian officials didn't stay silent about the human cost on their own side either. Iran's foreign minister publicly stated that villagers were killed while attempting to cross one of the struck bridges near Bandar Abbas. He described Iran as a homeland his country would defend from every direction, language clearly designed to rally domestic support. At a moment when the country's infrastructure was visibly under sustained pressure, Iran also pushed back through its own military statements. The Revolutionary Guards claimed they had stopped several ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz using a combined missile and drone operation. Whether that specific claim captures the full picture or not, the intent behind broadcasting it is clear. Iran wanted the world watching to know it could still make that waterway dangerous, even while its own supply lines were being dismantled piece by piece back on land. This is really the core tension underneath this entire conflict. The United States is trying to prove that Iran cannot control the Strait of Hormuz through fear and intimidation. Iran is trying to prove the opposite, that no matter how much pressure gets applied to its ports, bridges, or power grid, it still holds the power to make that waterway unsafe whenever it chooses. Both sides are fighting over the same narrow stretch of water, just using entirely different tools to do it. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, share it with someone who's been asking you what's actually going on with Iran, because most coverage floating around skips exactly the kind of detail that explains why any of this is happening. All right, let's keep going, because there's more underneath the surface here. Let's talk about why the Strait of Hormuz matters this much, because once this clicks, the rest of the conflict makes far more sense. Roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply moves through that narrow passage. Not one country's oil, the entire world's oil. Tankers coming out of the Gulf states, tankers heading toward Asia, tankers heading toward Europe, all funneled through a stretch of water barely wide enough for 2 large ships to pass safely at once. Whoever holds real influence over the flow of ships through that strait doesn't just control a regional shipping lane. They hold leverage over the global economy itself, energy prices at the pump, insurance costs for every tanker that sails through, supply chains stretching from offshore oil rigs to gas stations thousands of miles away. That's why a conflict happening in a relatively small stretch of water is being watched this closely by governments and markets across the planet. It's also worth understanding just how nervous global markets get whenever this specific waterway is threatened. Even a rumor of disruption near Hormuz can send oil prices climbing within hours, long before a single ship is actually stopped. Insurance companies quietly raise premiums for any vessel planning to sail through the region, and those extra costs eventually trickle down to ordinary people everywhere in the form of higher fuel prices and higher shipping costs on everyday goods. That's the strange, invisible way a conflict happening thousands of miles away ends up reaching into wallets on the other side of the planet. Some analysts describe Iran's long-term strategy using a phrase that sticks with you: a toll booth approach. Iran doesn't necessarily need to permanently close the strait. Doing that would devastate its own economy too, since Iran depends on that same route to export its own oil. What Iran seems to want instead is subtler and arguably more powerful. The ability to make the rest of the world believe closure is always just one provocation away. That threat alone generates leverage without Iran ever needing to fully pull the trigger. Looking back with that lens, an incident from earlier in this broader conflict suddenly makes more sense. Months before this bridge campaign, during what was supposed to be an active ceasefire, Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels moving through the region. At the time, many dismissed it as a mistake, an isolated flare-up. But now, next to everything that's happened since, a growing number of analysts believe it was something else. A test, a deliberate probe designed to find out whether the United States would actually respond with real force or quietly look away to protect. A fragile peace. Judging by the naval blockade now fully reimposed, the week of continuous strikes that followed, and the collapse of Bandar Abbas's transport network, the answer to that test is about as clear as it gets. The United States did not look away. It responded with sustained, escalating pressure and kept escalating even as Iran retaliated against American allies across the region. For Iran, that likely wasn't the outcome its original calculations were built around. A strategy based on quietly testing limits without triggering full-scale confrontation appears, at least in this moment, to have backfired. The supply routes feeding its most important naval base are in ruins. Its main oil export terminal is now under close watch after one tanker was disabled trying to reach it. By nearly every visible measure, Iran is operating from a noticeably weaker logistical position than it was just a few weeks earlier. Beyond the bridges, other targets tell the same story from a different angle. The control tower at Chabahar Port, near the Gulf of Oman, has reportedly been struck multiple times in recent weeks, eventually leaving the structure destroyed. Iran-Shah Airport, farther east, was also hit. Together with the destroyed bridges around Bandar Abbas, this paints a picture of a coordinated effort to dismantle an entire regional logistics web, roads, rail lines, ports, and airfields, treated as one connected target set. And it's worth understanding this isn't being carried out with a single weapon system acting alone. Reports describe a synchronized combination of fighter aircraft, surveillance drones, and naval vessels operating across the same coastal region and inland routes simultaneously. Long-endurance drones can stay airborne over one stretch of coastline for extended periods, tracking movement long before any strike decision is made. That kind of sustained surveillance lets military planners choose targets with far more precision than a single pass by a manned aircraft ever could. There's also a pattern worth noticing in how these strikes are carried out. Increasingly, the preferred approach favors disabling rather than fully destroying whenever possible. That's exactly what happened to the tanker near Karg Island, stopped without being sunk, without spilling oil, without creating an environmental disaster or a diplomatic firestorm involving a third country's flag. A disabled ship sends a powerful warning without automatically escalating into a full-blown international incident. A sunken vessel risks dragging additional countries directly into the conflict. Quick pause here, because we're getting into the part of this story that really matters for understanding where things go next. If this kind of deep breakdown is what you come to this channel for, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because this situation is moving fast, and I don't want you missing whatever happens next. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from too. I read every single one. All right, let's bring this all together. So let's connect everything we've walked through, because each piece on its own tells part of the story, but together they tell you exactly where this war is heading. Command centers and missile depots were hit first, aimed at weakening Iran's ability to coordinate and strike. Then came the naval blockade, aimed at restricting movement across the water. Then came the bridges and rail lines, aimed at cutting off movement across the land. And in response, Iran struck back at American allies across the region, including infrastructure civilians depend on for water and power. Individually, each of these looks like a separate headline in an exhausting news cycle. Together, they show a war that has expanded far beyond military hardware. It's now a war over the systems that keep an entire region functioning: roads, power grids, water supplies, shipping lanes. The invisible infrastructure most people never think about until it stops working. So, where does this go from here? Realistically, there are 3 paths, and it's worth walking through each, honestly, because nobody, not analysts, not officials, knows for certain which direction this lands. The first path is gradual de-escalation under continued pressure. The blockade stays enforced. Missile launches from Iran stay reduced because the routes needed to move newly produced weapons remain cut off. Bridges stay unusable long enough that Iran is eventually pushed toward negotiations from a position of genuine weakness. There are already small signs pointing this way. Iran's own energy ministry admitting grid damage on state media. Local officials openly describing serious transportation disruption around Bandar Abbas. The pressure appears to be landing exactly where the strikes were aimed. The second path is a prolonged stalemate. Neither side fully backs down. Neither side achieves a clean, decisive victory. Instead, both settle into an extended, uneasy rhythm of limited strikes followed by proportional retaliation without ever reaching a clear resolution point. Given how many consecutive days of strikes have already unfolded, and given that Iranian officials continue insisting there are no active negotiation channels open even while quietly admitting real damage, this outcome looks at least as plausible as any sudden diplomatic breakthrough. The third path is the one nobody watching this actually wants to see, and that's continued escalation. Attacks on critical infrastructure could keep expanding on both sides. More countries could get pulled directly into the fighting. Civilian consequences could keep growing. The strike on Kuwait's water and power infrastructure is a genuine early warning sign, a preview of what wider escalation could look like if this continues unchecked. Once civilian infrastructure becomes a target, even indirectly, both sides face mounting pressure to respond harder each time. And every response makes the eventual path toward a negotiated exit narrower. What's undeniable, regardless of which path this ultimately takes, is that the character of this war has already changed permanently. It's no longer a story about missiles versus missiles, or radar stations versus fighter jets. It's a story about supply chains, energy networks, control over a stretch of water that the entire global economy quietly depends on. Every single day, whether most people realize it or not. And that's really the deeper lesson buried inside this whole story, the one that stretches well beyond Iran, well beyond the Strait of Hormuz, well beyond this one specific conflict. Modern wars aren't only won or lost on battlefields anymore. Increasingly, they're decided by who controls the roads, the bridges, the power lines, and the ports that keep everyday life functioning in the background. Destroying a single missile stops one weapon. Destroying the road that carries every future weapon stops an entire system from functioning at all. That's a lesson military strategists have understood for decades, but rarely has it been demonstrated as clearly or as quickly as it was during that single night over Bandar Abbas. Think about what it actually means for a government to admit, through its own state media, that its power grid has sustained damage. That's not something any country does lightly. It's not a small technical detail buried at the bottom of a press release. It's an acknowledgement that pressure has reached past the military and directly into daily life for millions of ordinary people who have no control over any of this. People trying to run a small business, people trying to keep the lights on for their kids during a brutal summer heat wave, people who wake up every morning simply hoping the situation doesn't get worse before it has any real chance of getting better. That's the part of this story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Behind every strategic phrase, every term like logistical choke point or infrastructure campaign, there are real people quietly living through the consequences. Families in Bandar Abbas navigating blocked roads just to reach work or school. Communities in Kuwait dealing with damaged water infrastructure in the middle of an unbearable summer. None of them asked for any of this. All of them are living inside decisions made far above their heads by governments locked in a struggle over control of a waterway most of them will never personally sail through. So when we talk about bridges being destroyed, a naval blockade being enforced, or missile production slowing because the roads to move it no longer exist, we're not just describing military strategy on a whiteboard somewhere. We're describing the slow, grinding weight of war landing on ordinary life. One road, one power line, one water pipe at a time. That's what makes a story like this one matter, far beyond the headlines, the strike counts, and the geopolitical analysis. It's not only about who ultimately wins control of the Strait of Hormuz, it's about what happens to everyone caught living beside it while that fight continues. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict at a deeper level than most people scrolling past the headlines, and honestly, that says something good about you. Do me one last favor before you go. Comment below with what you genuinely think happens next: de-escalation, stalemate, or further escalation. I want to see where this community lands, because right now it could realistically go any one of those three ways. This war didn't start with bridges, and it almost certainly won't end with them either. But that single night over Bandar Abbas, when American forces stopped targeting weapons alone and started targeting the roads that carry them, marked the moment this conflict stopped being about isolated strikes and became something bigger. A slow, deliberate campaign aimed not just at what Iran can build or store, but at whether Iran can move any of it at all until those roads are rebuilt. Whatever path this takes from here, one thing is already unmistakably clear. The world just watched a superpower prove that in modern warfare, you don't always need to destroy what your enemy already has. Sometimes, all you need to destroy is the road that gets it there. And once that road is gone, everything behind it, no matter how powerful, no matter how well stocked, sits completely, silently, uselessly out of reach. That's the story of what happened outside Bandar Abbas, and it's a story still being written, day by day, strike by strike, as this conflict continues to unfold. Stay with me for the next update, because this one isn't over, not even close.